Hello students, and welcome to your first lecture about drugs. We're going to start the semester with the most friendly and popular drug of all, sugar. Everybody loves sugar, especially humans. So what we're going to do over the course of this lecture is pretty much what we're going to do for the rest of the lectures, which is answer a series of questions in order. So let's start with, what is it? Most of the time, when we think about sugar, we think about table sugar, the sort of like white granulated form, and that's what we like best as humans. We're really used to that sort of processed form. Sugar occurs in a lot of different plants, and there's a lot of different ways to make it, but most of the time we're talking about sort of a combination of glucose and fructose, which is a disaccharide. You don't need to know that part. Most of the time in the lecture today, when we're talking about sugar, we will be talking about heavily refined sugar and sometimes corn syrup. Sugar is one of our naturally occurring drugs, and that's part of why it's so popular. It's very easy to make. You can make it out of almost any plant all over the world. So sugar has a lasting popularity for that reason. The next thing that we like to ask is, okay, but what do we use it for? So primarily, sugar is used to sweeten things. Humans love sweet things, all mammals do. And we kind of will enter into a loop where the more you sweeten things, the more sweet you want things to be. And so our use of sugar does tend to escalate over the course of time. So for the most part, sugar is used to sweeten almost everything. That's one of the things we'll talk about later. We use it to sweeten things we wouldn't even think of as needing to be sweet. And it's also used, very important, to make alcohol. So that part is a little bit complicated, but all you really need to know is that if you trap sugar with yeast and no oxygen, the yeast will eat the sugar and then essentially poop air. So that's how yeast causes bread to rise. That's how yeast eats the sugar and turns it into alcohol. But sugar has been used to be alcohol for centuries, possibly even for millennia. So if you think about all the various kinds of alcohol, usually we start with a very specific sugar. Like wine is made from the sugar in grapes, mead is made from the sugar in honey, beer is made from the sugar in malted starches, and so on and so on. So you can't make alcohol without sugar. The other really key use for sugar is actually medicinal. Historically, it's been known that you can pour sugar in an open wound. I wouldn't recommend it unless you don't have anything else going on. Historically, it's been much more popular to use honey. Honey has been used, again, for millennia to help with wounds. What typically happens is that the sugar absorbs the moisture, which is where the bacteria grow, so that helps stop the bacteria from growing and becoming a problem. But also, within sugar and within honey, there are certain antimicrobial properties that just kill it outright. So if you're ever in a terrible situation and you need to, stop some bleeding and you don't have a first aid kit, but for some reason you have sugar, might as well try it. So the next question to address is, what is it used for? So sugar has a lot of properties that are valuable that make it a useful substance. The primary one is sweetening things. Humans love sweet things. And so we enter into a kind of a feedback loop sometimes where the more we sweeten things, the more sweet we want them to be. And that's going to be something we'll talk about later in the lecture. But most of the time we use sugar to take the bitterness or the acidity out of something that we want to eat. But it does have some other uses. We use it to preserve food. So if you think about jelly or candied fruit, it's really a good way to keep fruits lasting throughout the winter. We also use it, very important, to create alcohol. All alcohols are made out of sugar in some variety. So for instance, wine is made out of the sugar in grape, beer is made out of the sugar in malted starches, mead is made out of the sugar in honey. It's a very important part to the fermentation process. Essentially what happens, and again, you don't need to know the chemical process by which this happens, but essentially, if you lock yeast and sugar in a container together and deprive them of oxygen, the yeast eat the sugar and poop out air. So it's a little more complicated than that, but that's why bread rises, and that's why when alcohol is fermenting, you have to allow a way for the air to escape, otherwise it will blow up. In all, we're very grateful to sugar because it provides two of our favorite things, sweetness and alcohol. The next thing we'd like to ask is it medicinal? And sugar isn't particularly medicinal. It does have some medicinal qualities. So It has been used for millennia to treat wounds, and more specifically, honey has been very popular to treat wounds. We have evidence of ancient Egyptians using honey to treat wounds, bees being considered a really vital part of the community. So if you're ever in a terrible situation and you have an opened wound but no first aid kit, you can pour honey or sugar, if you have to, into the wound. If you use sugar, what happens is that it absorbs the moisture that allows the bacteria to grow. And honey does kind of the same thing, except that it also has natural antimicrobial properties. So it has historically been very useful for wound care. These days, we skip straight to antibiotics, but just in case, now you know you can do that. The next question we like to ask is it harmful? And the answer with sugar is yes. It's not so harmful in moderation. If you eat, the recommended amount of sugar over the course of the day, no problem. But it is harmful in excess, and it's one of our biggest problems happening in America right now. So essentially, if you overeat on sugar, it can turn directly into a series of health conditions. It can be bad for heart disease, any kind of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, extreme weight gain. If you gain a lot of weight, it is then hard on your body in other ways. So the overconsumption of sugar is in fact very dangerous. So if you look at these graphs, what I'm going to show you first, a map of the United States that's tracking obesity in 2019. So as you can see in this map, there's a vast difference between which states are struggling with obesity and which states aren't. And one of the things that we're going to see pretty consistently over the course of the semester is that the southern, especially the southeastern states, tend to have the worst problems with drugs. So if we look at this map, that's pretty clear. Mississippi and Alabama, basically the most obese. As you move further west, people tend to get less obese. Colorado, very healthy. What's interesting about this map is that what we're seeing is consistently throughout America, about 40% of the population is obese. And the way that we measure obesity is problematic because most of the time we measure it with BMI, which has proven to be scientifically kind of whatever. If we're looking at essentially how large Americans have become, it's one way of measuring it, like to the extent of like what kind of unhealthy fat they're carrying. This map is obesity rates 2019. The next map is the projected obesity rates 2030. So in this map, you'll notice it has changed very significantly in terms of obesity gaining. So in this map, we're looking at, again, in the southeast, a lot of those states being 60% obese, whereas for most of the country, we're looking at people being about 50%. So what that really means is that we don't know, but we expect that Americans will become increasingly fatter, and we're pretty sure this is down to sugar intake and high fructose corn syrup, which we'll talk about. And so is sugar dangerous? Not by itself, but it can cause things like this. I also wanted to show you this map, which is 2008, so it's a little old, but it's breaking down obesity by county. And this is a really interesting way of looking at data as well, because one of the things that we talk about a lot in class is the way that Atlanta is not Georgia. We're in Georgia, but Atlanta is different from Georgia. And so if you look specifically at Georgia in this map, you'll notice that obesity rates are higher outside of Atlanta and lower in Atlanta. There's a very definitive urban-rural aspect here, which we'll talk about. This graph is about the way that Americans are getting increasingly obese over the course of time. So one of the problems with sugar is that we have increasingly added it to the foods that we eat, and we have increasingly added it kind of secretly into things where we wouldn't expect it. So what we think is happening is that the foods that are available for Americans to eat are just chock full of sugar, chock full of high fructose corn syrup, and so gradually the nation is becoming fatter. So what we saw in the last map was how it varies by state, and what we're seeing in this graph is an overall picture for the United States. So as you can see, in 99 to early 2000, it was relatively low, about 30%, but over the course really of the last 18 years, it's gone from about 30% to about 42%. So it is steadily on the increase. The rate of obesity in America, as again related to sugar, also changes by several social factors. So one of the things that we'll talk about over the course of the semester, again, is the way that drugs impact people of different races and classes and genders differently, and also they tend to impact people who are different ages differently. So in this graph, what we're looking at is men and women. So you wouldn't think necessarily there would be such a big difference in the rate of obesity between men and women, or really in the gain of men and women. But if you look at this graph, what you'll notice is that it's broken into overweight men, overweight women, obese women, obese men, and extremely obese women, extremely obese men. The main thing that I want you to notice over the course of this graph is the extent to which pretty much everything went up. The rate of weight gain in Americans is pretty much always on an upward trend. There are major differences between who tends to be overweight and who tends to be obese. So in this graph, what we see is that it's common for men to be overweight. They're a little bit more overweight than women, but everything else, in the obesity and the extreme obesity, women lead men. So what that means is that women have a higher likelihood of being obese or extremely obese. Why that is another one of the things that we'll talk about over the course of today and over the course of the semester. But the fact that there's a gender difference is very important here. This graph is looking at age. So one of the things that we hear a lot in regard to sugar is that we're worried about how fat the kids are, or we're worried about how much sugar is in kids' food or kids' cereal especially. So in this graph, what we're looking at is obesity rates longitudinally from 1999-2000 up to 2015-2016. And you'll notice that adults are more obese than children, but the children trending upward. So we do see a difference between ages. And this might be down to choice. Very often children don't choose what they're eating and adults do, but it might also be down to metabolism. Children typically have a higher metabolism than adults. So that's another one of those interesting social issues that we can continue to look at. In this graph, we're looking at race and gender. So in this graph, you'll notice we have on the left here the Black population, in the middle Hispanic, white, and then Asian. So this one shows us that there is not only a significant difference in obesity between the genders. Women tend to be, again, more obese than men. There's also an interesting obesity incidence within race. So you'll notice that the Black population, especially Black women, have the highest rate of obesity, followed by Hispanic women. And what we think is happening here is, again, access to healthy foods. The most processed foods are the most affordable foods, and the most processed foods tend to have very high levels of sugar and high fructose corn syrup as well. So essentially we think this is not about race. This is not something that is part of your genetic code or something that you're born with. We think this is about food, and food is very often about what you can get to and what you can afford. So if you live in a food desert, which is what we call it when you're more than a mile from a grocery store, the options that you have for eating are mostly what you can get at the convenience store or the gas station. So in that case, you're eating almost exclusively heavily processed foods, which are chock full of sugar and high fructose corn syrup. So what we think is going on is not that people of different races are naturally of different weights, but rather that people of different races are segregated in America in such a way that there's a food disparity issue. The last graph we're going to look at is another longitudinal graph. This one is tracking sugar intake versus obesity prevalence. So what we expect to see is that sugar and obesity will rise equally at the same rate. What we in fact see is that in 2000 there's a weird sort of drop off. And there's two things that we think might be going on here. And one is that they're measuring sugar but not high fructose corn syrup, which is technically a different substance. And the other is that they might be measuring salty foods. Obesity doesn't come solely from sugar. So it could be that as our rate of sugar intake has gone down, our rate of caloric intake itself has not gone down. So this is kind of an interesting graph because we're tracking one of two things, and one is salty foods and the other is high fructose corn syrup. The next question we like to ask is it addictive? And the answer for sugar is a little complicated. We're kind of not sure. On the one hand, yes, it triggers a chemical reaction in the brain that we want more of, so you could call that addictive. On the other hand, if you stop taking it, you do have negative effects in terms of withdrawal, so we could call that addictive. But generally speaking, we do not consider it to be one of the addictive substances, and it's not one of our addictive drugs that we'll talk about this semester. So if we look at this pictorial right here, what we see is how eating sugar releases dopamine in your brain, which makes you want more dopamine. There's just nothing humans love more than dopamine. So essentially what happens is that you eat the sugar causes your blood sugar level to spike, and when that happens, dopamine is released into your brain. And then What happens then is that your blood sugar level falls and you feel kind of gross, your body craves that sugar high, and so you do whatever you can to get more dopamine, which in this case is released via sugar, so you create an endless cycle. You eat sugar, you feel great, you feel terrible, you eat more sugar, you feel great, you feel terrible. So in that regard, you could consider it moderately addictive, although again, if you stop eating sugar, you won't die. The other thing that makes sugar relatively addictive is this idea that you might experience withdrawal symptoms when you stop eating it. So, like I said, you won't die, but you might feel cranky. You might have headaches, you might have stomach aches, you might have a lowered level of energy. So, in that regard, some scientists have argued that sugar is addictive. Essentially, they've argued that some humans develop a tolerance, and then when you can't meet that tolerance, you show symptoms of withdrawal. There have been a few studies that have compared sugar to cocaine, and I want to point out very clearly these studies are only done on rats so far. But what they find is that if the rat has to choose between sugar and cocaine, the rats will choose sugar. So there have been several studies that have shown the same thing. Rats do tend to prefer sugar over cocaine, but does that mean that sugar is more addictive than cocaine? I would argue not. There's some problems with these studies. But they exist, and they make their way into the news headlines really often because that's a very exciting pictorial. So ultimately, is sugar addictive? Not really. The next question we like to ask ourselves is, who is addicted? With sugar, that's a little complicated because on the one hand, no one is addicted. It's not particularly addictive. On the other hand, kind of everyone is addicted because there's so much sugar in our diets. So if, for instance, you changed tomorrow to a radically different diet, you might notice that there's an absence of sugar in your diet. You might have headaches or something like that. So who is addicted is kind of a tricky question. We're most worried about children being addicted to sugar, but that's usually not too much of a problem. Most people who are addicted to sugar are actually adults who do the majority of the sugar intake. So in regard to who is addicted, kind of all of us. The recommended amount of sugar that we eat every day is between about 6 and 9 teaspoons, but the amount that most Americans eat every day is between 20 and 22 teaspoons. So in a sense, we are all consuming a lot of this drug. The next question we like to ask is, how much is consumed? And this is a little bit tricky to measure. Most estimates would assume that the average American adult is eating about 20 teaspoons a day, like I said, and that adds up huge over the course of your lifetime. By the end of your lifetime, you may have eaten like a dump truck full of sugar. Over the course of a day, your rates may vary, and of course some people eat it more than others. The important thing to recognize in terms of sugar consumption is that it is rising steadily over the course of the years. So if you look at this graph, what we're measuring here, it's longitudinal from 1820 to 2000. And we're measuring the sugar consumption in pounds per year per person. So here you see exactly what we expected to see. There's just only an upward climb, really. There's a couple of times when it dips that usually corresponds to wars, which is no accident. But as we see, the biggest change happens to come right before 1980, which is when we started to institute dietary guidelines. So that's when we started to get worried about sugar. That's when we started to say, like, that children shouldn't have so much, and that adults shouldn't have so much either. After we instituted those dietary guidelines, we knew that sugar was a little bit more dangerous for us, but that didn't stop us from doing anything. So how much sugar we consume is pretty much only on the up and up. This graph is comparing sugar consumption between multiple countries. So in this graph, what we're looking at is annual sugar consumption between the United States, Canada, and several members of the European Union. What we'll see here is, no surprise, America's number one. But being number one is sugar consumption, maybe not the best. But if you notice here, most of the countries that are at the top of the sugar consumption graph here are first world countries. Most of them are Western European, and that's largely a result of who is eating the most processed foods, which is, again, very similar to what we were talking about in terms of hidden sugar consumption. In this graph is sort of another way of exploring that same thought. This one is looking at the global sugar supply in terms of how much people eat in each country per day. And you'll notice here that America is really in a league of our own. This is pretty next level. then the people who are most easily compared to us tend to be spread out all over the world, although very often in places where it's easy to manufacture sugar, from sugar cane or from beets or from corn. And the places with the lowest sugar consumption tend to be here in East Asia and, of course, in Central Africa. That is sort of working on two fronts, and one is production levels and one is just culture. So cultures just don't like things as sweet as we do. In this graph, we're looking at the caloric intake by sweeteners. So this is when you add sugar or high fructose corn syrup to something else that you're already eating. And I just wanted to show you this graph because you can see that, once again, America #1, we tend to have a much higher rate of both calories from sugar and calories from high fructose corn syrup than almost anybody else in the world. The Canada and Argentina also have relatively high levels of high fructose corn syrup, but the point of this graph really is just to show you how much sugar we're taking in compared to almost every other country in the world. One of the ways that we take in that vast amount of sugar is sugary drinks. We love sugary drinks, especially in Atlanta, right, the home of Coca-Cola. So in this graph, you can see that we are third in terms of sugary drinks by country, bested only by Mexico and Chile. But you'll notice that most of the other countries that we see in this graph consume far fewer calories based on sugary drinks than we do in America. The final graph that I wanted to show you is measuring sugar intake by both race and income. So again, these are very sociological things to examine. So the amount of sugar you eat does vary by several different variables, of course. And in this one, I think it's really interesting. You can tell that people who are experiencing higher levels of poverty are eating more sugar. Again, that goes back to the affordability of highly processed foods. You'll also notice that the poverty and the race aspect do tend to coincide. In America, there's a very heavy correlation between race and poverty. So you'll notice that people who are typically considered to be the most likely to be impoverished, which is definitely our Black and Hispanic communities, do tend to eat more sugar. So it's really no accident that these two graphs are so closely intertwined. The next thing that we want to ask ourselves is, how expensive is it? This is always a really interesting question with drugs because they can get very expensive, but sugar is one of our most affordable drugs. How much sugar costs is kind of weird. Typically, sugar is not very expensive. It's not particularly expensive to produce or to refine, but it does get weird because in America, we have sugar tariffs. So the federal government established a minimum price that consumers have to pay for sugar. And what that means is that even if another country makes sugar more cheaply than we do, they have to pay tariffs so that their sugar is not cheaper than American sugar. So if you have ever been to the store and noticed varying prices in sugar, it has a lot to do with what was manufactured here and what was manufactured elsewhere. So we have these sugar tariffs, and that keeps the price of sugar a little bit higher than it might necessarily need to be. And we also have sugar taxes. So sometimes you are taxed on buying a sugary drink. This happens in a couple of locations in America, and there's a couple others around the world. If we look at this map here, what we see is that there are 8 places in the Americas that have a sugar tax. There aren't any states that do it right now. It tends to be cities and municipalities. But basically what they do is they charge just a little tiny tax on sugary drinks and then put that money back into the sort of the city coffer. If you look around the world, there are several countries that do the same thing, that tax sugary drinks and put it back into their monetary fund that everybody shares. Very often it's used as part of your tax dollars. In this graph, we can see a representation of how much sugar costs in America versus how much it costs everywhere else. And you'll notice that over the course of these 11 years, sugar was consistently higher when it was made in the US versus when it was made anywhere else. There's some variation over the course of these years. It got more expensive everywhere. But because of our sugar tariffs, America's sugar is always more expensive. The other cost associated with sugar is not about the buying sugar, but about the impact of sugar. So one of the things that we'll examine over the course of the semester is the way that the drug creates problems later on. So for instance, sugar is cheap to buy, but if you eat too much of it and you develop health problems, then the result of sugar becomes expensive. So when we talk about how expensive it is, one of the things we have to look at is how expensive the result of consuming the drug is. So with sugar, in terms of obesity, it gets expensive. In general, if you look at these graphs, obesity-related illnesses account for a lot of our medical spending in America. And a person who is obese tends to spend much more per year on their health care than someone who is not. So essentially, your level of obesity is directly correlated to your healthcare costs. If we look at this graph, this is from 2014, and what we're looking at is the total cost of medical care that are attributable to obesity. So it's not that like being obese is expensive, it's that it causes a host of other problems. So for instance, if we look here, we see that hypertension is one of our biggest problems. It's a very expensive one. Running neck and neck with diabetes type 2, and of course chronic back pain, because carrying a lot of weight is very difficult for your skeleton. So again, it's not that the sugar itself is the most expensive part, it's the health that comes from the eating of the sugar. It's the medical costs, it's the disparity that we see in terms of what the sugar does to your body. So just for a second, I want to make a brief foray from sugar into high fructose corn syrup, which is technically a different thing. So all vegetables and all fruits have a little bit of sugar in them, and you can cook them down and combine them with other chemicals to make a very sweet substance. And so what we do with corn is we essentially cook it down. Again, we don't need to go into the chemical process until such a point as we get a very sweet syrup. It's not technically sugar. It does have a lot of fructose, but the thing that's tricky about high fructose corn syrup is that corn is subsidized by the government. So sugar cane is not subsidized by the government. Beets are not subsidized by the government, at least not the kind you make sugar out of. So it's a lot cheaper for farmers to grow corn. They can get paid by the government to grow corn and then turn that into high fructose corn syrup. So very often in America, most of what we consider to be our sugar intake comes from high fructose corn syrup instead of like sugar properly. So if you look at this as a pictographic that's, to be fair, trying to demonize high fructose corn syrup, it's always important to keep in mind the viewpoint of the people who made the graph. But in this one, what we're looking at are foods that have the highest quantity of high fructose corn syrup contained within them. And some of this, I think, would be rather surprising. We think of high fructose corn syrup as being part of a sweet food, you know, where we expect to see it in something like perhaps a cereal bar or applesauce. But the truth is that it's in a lot of other things that we might not anticipate. So we see it very often in bread and pizza. We see it in macaroni and cheese, tomato sauces and ketchup. So high fructose corn syrup is prevalent in a lot of ways because we don't notice that it's there. In this graph, what you'll see is, again, a longitudinal. This is the consumption per capita of refined sugar in green and high fructose corn syrup in red. And what you'll notice is that as the government begins to subsidize corn, we see a direct switch. In the mid-'80s, more people are getting their sugar, their caloric intake from high fructose corn syrup than they are from sugar itself. Now, there has been a bit of a switch back, and we think that this is because of our new sort of appreciation of natural sugars. You might see a lot of things that are like stevia or Splenda or Demerara sugar in the raw. We have invented a lot of new ways to eat sugar, a lot of which aren't high fructose corn syrup. So high fructose corn syrup is a little bit on the decline, but it's still very, very prevalent. The next question is one of my favorite ones. Is it legal? Yes. You can buy as much sugar as you want. You could go to the store and buy nothing but sugar. You could go to the store and buy all of the sugar. There's nothing stopping you from buying as much sugar as you can fit in your car. This is kind of an interesting one. We know that it's dangerous. We know that we want people to eat less of it, but there is nothing stopping you from eating sugar, so knock yourself out. The question that is kind of related to the legality issue is it socially acceptable? So sure, it's legal, but are people going to look at you if you leave the grocery store with an entire cart full of sugar? And the answer to that is yes. In a lot of ways, sugar is still completely socially acceptable. Again, we all eat a lot of it every day. But we are starting to become more concerned. We're starting to frown upon a great deal of sugar intake in children. We're starting to choose products that are made with less sugar or what we consider to be a healthier sugar. You'll notice here we've got these two like soda cans that are proclaiming themselves to be made with natural sugar. And we're encouraging people to sort of turn away from sugar and turn towards healthier options. So is sugar socially acceptable? Yes, we love sugar. But we do kind of frown on overconsumption. We're trying to sort of turn towards a more moderate version of how much sugar we should eat every day. So those are all the things that you need to know about sugar. The things that I want you to keep in mind are, of course, the most sociological. The way that we take our drugs has a lot to do, of course, with our race, with our class, with our gender, with our geographic location, and sugar is a very important part of all of that. It's probably the most popular drug in America, second only to caffeine, and it's certainly the only drug I would be happy with you doing in the classroom, aside from caffeine. But it is a major problem in America in terms of health problems. Sugar itself is not dangerous. Eating a lot of sugar, which again is unavoidable because it's in everything, can be dangerous. So this, again, one of our most prevalent drugs, but one of the ones we take the least seriously. So join me for our next video in which we'll talk about one of sugar's best friends, caffeine.